Thank you very much. All right, I'm going to be quiet for a moment and let this video roll so you get a better intro than me.
In 2000, he sailed round the globe on the world's toughest yacht race. He battled hurricanes, icebergs, and 100-foot waves, and he went back for more. In 2014, he did it all again, but this time with a very different crew. His crew were his children and his wife, aged 9, 7, 2, and I'm not allowed to say. He's built many teams, but this was by far the toughest. His recent book, Where the Magic Happens, became an international bestseller. He's regularly featured in the media globally, from CNN to the BBC and the Financial Times. He shares his stories and insights on stages around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome round the world sailor, team building and leadership expert, and officially the best dad in the world, Caspar Craven.
All right. Now I can start. I have to say, I was really enjoying seeing the slides back there. You guys have a lot of fun. There's a lot of stuff going on in this world. I think I want to come and join you on some of these. So, look, what I'd like to do over the next 20-25 minutes is to share a few stories, mostly of times where I've made mistakes and failed big time, and have learnt things from that, and pull out one or two lessons which hopefully will be useful for you either in business life or in family life. So before we dive in, I just want to deal with the elephant in the room here. Who here has kids? Okay, that's most of you. Who here remembers being a child? Hopefully we've got everybody covered. Okay, who here thinks I must be absolutely insane to take a 2-year-old around the world? Yeah, that's fine, that's the usual reaction. We'll talk a little bit about that. So look, I've got 4 stages. Here we go. Charting success, 4 steps to navigating a winning team, and the subtext is also how can you build a business that can run without you, because that was one of the things that we had to do. So we're going to go on a little journey around the world, and I'm going to break it up using a timeline just into different stages. So the first step is all about setting a really clear direction. Where are you going with your team? And I want to take you back to 2009. And this is where the idea to sail around the world started. So this is my wife sitting here at our kitchen table. And back in 2009, we were at my sister's garden party. It's her 40th birthday. And someone told us about this family who sailed around the world and then went on to say what a ridiculous idea it was. And that was the seed that caught the imagination of both my wife and I. So we spent the next 6 months talking about how do we want our lives to be different. And we created a vision statement, literally this piece of paper here, saying what were the things that were really important to us and our family, what do we want to go and do. That was the actual vision statement there, and we said, you know, we need to make this amount of money, and on the 1st of August 2014, we're going to go and set sail and go off around the world. And once we had that, and we stuck that on the kitchen wall, what did we do then? We started telling everyone about it. The first reaction, everybody laughed, right? Told us all the reasons that we shouldn't go and do this. Now, there was a lot of truth in some of those reasons, to be honest. The one thing we had in our favour, I'd sailed around the world before. This was my boat here leaving Cape Town, so I had quite a lot of experience. The things that we didn't have in our favour were all these ones here. We didn't have the money, not even remotely close. So back then, I had a small consultancy business. We were turning over about 400 grand, losing money, and the idea of buying a boat was completely ridiculous. By the way, when people usually meet me for the first time, they say, your name's Caspar, you sound like a posh toff, you must have bucket loads of money. But the reality was back then, we didn't at all. So, no money. My wife, Nicola, she couldn't sail. And in fact, the only 2 times she'd been on a boat, she'd been seasick. And on top of that, we didn't have a boat either. So, lots and lots of good reasons why this shouldn't happen. But I'm a great believer that, you know, if there's something that you make a real committed decision to going and doing, you get that story about where you're going. If you've got time, if you've got energy, I think you can make anything happen. So very simply, you know, the first step, kind of obvious, right? But you're setting the direction for you and your team and say, where are we going? Why does this matter? Our reason why was that we wanted to create magical, life-changing experiences for us and our children. Back then when I was working 16, 18 hours a day in the business, barely saw the kids and barely saw my wife. And it's like, you know what, there's got to be a better way than doing this. So that was the story we created. We said we want to create a story of the future that's fundamentally different from where we are now. Okay, let me share a few more mistakes that I made. So, step 2, about creating a culture of what I call we, not me. And time period, 2009 through 2012. And I mentioned my business. This is my business partner, Ed. And our offices were in Vauxhall in the old Marmite building, Westminster Business Square, if anyone knows that. And you're probably looking at that picture saying, why is Ed wearing yellow ear defenders? Well, the actual reason was it was to block out the noise because we were right on the busy road. But actually, the metaphor that it stood for was much more powerful, because in our business, I wasn't listening to him, he wasn't listening to me, and neither of us were really listening to the messages that our business was telling us and what was actually going on. Einstein, right, says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing but expecting a different result. So beforehand, I'd always said in my business, in 5 years' time, I'm going to exit this business and then go off and do what I really want to go and do. But that 5 years always stayed 5 years away, right? By putting that timeline lining that down and saying 2014, we're now getting closer and closer. So we're now 3 years away. And I realized that nothing was fundamentally changing in the business. I decided to go and immerse myself in learning and find the best people that I could who'd successfully grown that type of business. I did that end of 2011, came back loaded up with ideas, and came back into my business at the beginning of 2012, literally like a tornado. I was hiring new staff, launching new products, creating hundreds of videos, and literally just trying to do everything that I could. We ran for 3 months doing that, and we got to a crunch point when Ed, my business partner, took me to one side, and he said, Caspar, you're being an absolute nightmare. He said, if you carry on doing that, everyone, including me, is going to leave the business. I sat down and I asked myself the best question that I've ever asked myself, and it was this: how do I build a business that can run without me? Because I thought, you know what, if we're going to be on a boat at some point, I'm trying to do all this on my own. I need to think about this in a fundamentally different way. And the moment that I asked that question, all sorts of things started to come up. The immediate reactions: it can't be done. No one's done this before. The business is dependent on me. I'm such a core part of it. It'll go bust. The market's too competitive. I can't get the right people. All these things started popping up in my mind. And then I had some inner demons as well. With my identity was tied to the business. I was the CEO of the business, and therefore if I stepped out of that and let somebody else run that, what does that then say about me? What's the value that I bring? So I had all these questions swirling around inside my head. But I knew that I had to do something fundamentally different. I went and found this lady. Her name's Margaret Meyer, and she's a leadership consultant. And we sat down and we talked about how can we build an incredible business that doesn't need me at the heart of it. And she told me this phrase. Some of you may have heard this African proverb, that it's if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's all about finding an amazing team of people and getting them to carry the business so you can really go and do things. We did a huge amount of work on values. Back in the day, I used to work in KPMG, and I remember thinking back then that values was a whole bunch of BS. They had a list of 10 values. By the time I got to the end of reading the second one, I couldn't even remember what the first one was. And but in this new process, I had to think about things very, very differently. We spent a lot of time with the business defining what our values were. How do we work together as a team? Because I realized that values are the thing that shape your behaviors. Behaviors shape your actions. Actions shape your outcomes. And I made the mistake that I went back into the business and I said, here's our values. And the business just shook their head at me and said, no, they're not. So I realized actually we had to create them together, create the story of how do we really work together as a business. That planted the seed of really changing the trajectory over that business. For the next 12 months, we grew at the fastest rate we'd ever grown. We made more profits than we made in the previous 6 years, and it really started to canter things along. This is us in Amsterdam celebrating after we started smashing our quarterly results. We developed this saying in the business of no ego. it doesn't matter who is right, it only matters what is right, and allowing the best ideas to surface. And we came up with this thing that we substituted the joy of being right for the joy of finding the truth. And for us, that was super, super important. How do we find the right answer for all these different challenges that we're facing? I then took those ideas and I thought, if I'm going to hit that target of 5 million quid to go and sail around the world, this business on its own isn't going to go and do it. So I took exactly the same ideas and started launching other businesses. The primary one was online dating sites, and we ended up creating 500 online dating sites, all in different niches, over a 6-month period, literally following a very, very, very fast ramp up. And again, starting to build an amazing team who could make these things happen. Now, around the same time, I was starting to think about this question: how do we prepare our family to go around the world? Because those of you who've got kids will know what it's like when you get in the motorway and you're driving down and some child turns around, it's like, are we nearly there yet? And when you've got another 3,000 miles to go at sea in another 3 weeks, you better have a pretty good answer for that. So what do? We decided to do values at home, exactly the same thing that was transforming the business. You can see, by the way, our kitchen wall with the map of the world there and the vision statement, so everybody could still come in and laugh at us and tell us all the reasons why we shouldn't do it. This was the actual values picture here that the kids all created. You can see all their handprints around it. We didn't just create this and then forget about it. We said, what is it that we do when we display this value at its very best? And we started to create little prizes which we handed out every week, every day, saying what are the values that we're really living well, how are we really sort of demonstrating these. Now, around the same time, we're thinking about all the preparation we need to do. So we have a standing joke in my family that with my wife and I, if it was down to my wife, nothing would ever get started. If it was down to me, nothing would ever get finished. So we complement each other really, really well. But we had to think about all the different areas that you need to be safe to go to sea. So whenever you saw Nicola for those last 2 years, she would literally have this file underneath her arm with all these different spreadsheets, all the different areas which we've got to cover, covering becoming a ship's doctor, the weather, the radio, right down to potty training with a 2-year-old on board. I forgot to mention that. Around this time we had our 3rd child and everybody sort of said, you're not going now. And it's like, no, this is part of the plan. We're going. We're just going to have 3 children on board. But we weren't taking our responsibilities lightly. We were taking them very seriously and looking at each of the risks one by one and saying, how do we get comfortable with that? This photo here, Nicola, she's on our ship's doctor's course. It's the most advanced medical training you can get outside of becoming outside of becoming a doctor or a nurse. So she's practicing sewing up some sutures there. I don't know why she's looking so happy, but anyway. So that went on for those final 2 years about really starting to get everything prepared. And I guess, the lessons and the things that I pull out of all of this is, if you want to do any amazing goal, whether it's with your business, whether it's your family, you've got to think about that thing. Do you want to go far or do you want to go fast? And if you want to go far, you've really got to engage the team and the people around you. For me, it was that thing about no ego, focusing on what's right, not what's wrong, and also thinking about who's in your team. I'm great at the big picture. Nicola, she's great at all the detail. Miss any part out and you're going to have problems. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories now as we actually sailed around the world. This, by the way, is an abbreviated version of a full 8 steps that I take people through. So it's just a small taster in the time. But the point here is talking all about how do you really get a team to function and fly along together. And I want to tell you a few stories from our first big ocean, sailing across the Atlantic. So we sailed from the UK, the arrow's a little bit off, but down to the Canary Islands, and we're heading across to the Caribbean. Now we've got 3 kids on board, age 9, 7 and 2. So one of the things we've got to do is homeschooling with the kids. And I have newfound respect for teachers because I realise just how hard a gig it is teaching. And what we decided to do was just take advantage of all the things that are around us. So one of the guys we sailed with was Pete, who was an admiral in the US Navy, and he's sitting there one day doing his sextant. So I said, look, can you teach my son? His name was Columbus, by the way. We did name him clearly for this. And so he's teaching Columbus how to use the sextant, and he's measuring the angles, and he's learning about all the different solar bodies. And you realise that the learning is all around you. As we're sailing across the Atlantic, I remember one particular day when I'm sitting down with Columbus, trying to teach him about Tudor England, the kings and queens of England. And I came up back after an hour, and the workbook was just like, the page was just blank white. And it's like, he just wasn't even remotely interested. So I sat down with him, I said, what's going on? And he said, I just don't want to do this. So I said, what do you want to learn about? So he said, I'm fascinated with fishing. So we started reading all the fishing books, learning about the different fish in the different oceans. He then started catching fish, started weighing them, measuring them, writing his journal, set up a business making and selling fishing lures. He'd go around all the other boats in the Caribbean selling his fishing lures for $5 a piece and the advice sheets for $1 a piece. We started dissecting the fish. So what we did is we took that one thing that he was fascinated with and started to follow it in all the different areas. Same with my little one, Willow, right? She had a big bucket of Lego. She'd tip it out everywhere, all over the floor. So we made a game out of it. Well, now you've got to hoover up, give her the Dyson, and start going around and sort of, cleaning up the mess she'd made. My 9-year-old Bluebell, she could talk for England, right? So what do? We make her our radio operator. The question, do you notice the strengths in your team? I remember back in my business, I hired a guy to be a frontline salesperson. After the first 3 months, he was closing deals left, right, and centre. After that, he completely dried up. And I sat down with him and said, Jules, what's going on? And he said, I don't like rejection, which, as you know, for a salesperson is not a good quality, because a salesperson, you're going to get rejected a lot. So we moved him to a different role, and he became one of our consultants. And so he started working with our high-end clients, Microsoft, IBM, and so on. And that went really well, until one day he sent data from one bank to another bank, almost killed the business. Wasn't great. We realised his attention to detail wasn't quite there. So we tried again, and we moved him to be head of our customer success and working with our top tier clients. And that was the role where he absolutely flourished in. And I'll talk a little bit later about when we sold that business as we're sailing across the Pacific. But that was the thing which really captured his imagination. And the fundamental thing, right? All the people that you work with, whether it's in your family team, whether it's in your business team, is to get people in roles that they love doing so that they thrive even more. I remember back in KPMG days, here's the job description, here's the things you've got to do, half the stuff I loved, half the stuff I hated. Trying to get people to do stuff they don't want to do, it's kind of pointless, right? So the thing that really transformed the business and helped us with the education is getting each person in the right roles. So we sailed across the Atlantic. That was our first big ocean. And the lessons that we really learned from that was this thing all about focusing on your strengths and finding the right roles for each person. If we hadn't done that with the kids, they would have become terrorists on board, right? So we had to get them engaged and doing stuff they love doing. Okay, final step. Scary story coming up if anyone wants one of those. Anyone want a scary story? Okay. Hey. No pirates in this story. This is all about living your values, the things I've already touched upon. So, Feb 2015, and we're about to cross the Pacific Ocean. It's going to be our route here through the Panama Canal, all the way across the Pacific to Australia. It's going to take us about 6 months to do that. We come through the Panama Canal. It's a bit scary. You have ships like this coming up behind you, and it's like, I really hope they're going to stop, right? Because they just leave you absolutely destroyed. You come out the other side. This is a very famous bridge. It's called the Bridge of Americas. We came out underneath that, an amazing moment. It's the gateway to the Pacific. You mentioned about skiing. My analogy of this, it's like coming out of here, it's like you've got 6 months worth of perfect powder skiing in front of you, and you're just going to keep going with that. Coming across the Pacific, you've got the trade winds and the currents. You set your sails and like, poof, you're just off. Amazing place to go. By now, the kids are getting pretty good on board. So Columbus is now steering the boat, taking a watch. Willow's up on deck. Whenever she sees land, like land ho, I can see what's coming up ahead. And we're getting involved in all the wildlife. Columbus hanging off the back of a 4.5 metre nurse shark. And so really absorbing all these different things. This is a special day. The culmination of so we set up those various businesses. And the largest business, it was a data analytics company. As we sailed across the Atlantic, we had 2 offers to buy us. And we selected preferred bidder in the Caribbean. And then as we sailed across the Pacific, we were negotiating heads of terms with the buyer, a South African company that bought us. And this is us on 1st of May 2015, and celebrating in Bloody Mary's in Bora Bora, where we signed the deal, a 7-figure sum we sold the business for. But it was all testament to the fact that we put in place a team that could run the business without us, really built that culture, really built all these things I'm talking about building on people's strengths. And of course the other business was still running as well, and we had other people running those ones too. All right, in amongst all of this, you're going to have a bit of scary stuff, right? So you know that, like, in life and business, something's going to go wrong at some point. You just don't know what it's going to be. And one of our scary moments, we were deep in mid-Pacific, about 500 miles from land. So what's that, from here to the top of Scotland, roughly. And we had complete power failure on the boat. So what does power failure mean? So anyone remember the film Apollo 13? Remember that? Where you've got the 3 astronauts up in space and they had power failure? It was a little bit like that, apart from the fact we didn't have 3 astronauts, another 50 rocket scientists back at Cape Canaveral. It was me, Nicola, and the 3 kids. So we're out there in the middle of nowhere, and no power basically means that you've got no autopilot, which is the thing that steers the boat, no lights, no winches, no cooker, no stove, no navigation equipment, and we're completely isolated and out there on our own. And when that's happening, of course, you always have the worst conditions. This is the only photo I've got from that time. I wasn't thinking what would make a great photo if I came and did keynote talks. It was, how do we stay alive? And the dots, by the way, this is driving rain coming across here. We've got 30 or 40 knot winds. We've got waves breaking over the boat. So what would you do in that situation? You're sitting there with your team, bouncing around in this boat in the middle of nowhere. What would you do? I'm pretty certain if I'd been back in my corporate world, my first reaction, it's your fault, not you, sir, but just generally, and I would have started blaming somebody for what had gone wrong. But what good's that going to do, right? Getting cross, getting angry. Here's what we did. Remember our values, these things we talked about? This was defining our behaviours. How are we going to do things together as a team? Every day we gave out little stickers to the kids talking about what they were doing right rather than what they were doing wrong. So these things naturally became our first instinct. So we decided to find the humour in the situation. We told the kids we had no working toilets anymore, and we introduced them to the buckets. And they literally lined up on deck to poo in the bucket and chuck it over the side. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever done. They were literally crying with laughter. They called it the bucket and chuck it system. And that just sort of broke the ice. And then literally for the next 4 days, we worked as a team. Nicola and I, we would steer for half an hour at a time each. The kids would bring us up food and water on deck. There was laughter, there was harmony, there was compassion. We were looking after each other, and we didn't just survive, we thrived because we lived our values. Those things that I once thought were a whole bunch of BS, that was defining how we're going to deal with things when times get tough. The formula I always teach my kids is this one here, E plus R equals O, where E is the event, something that happens to you. R is your reaction, what do you do as a result of that? And O is the outcome. It's all about your reaction in any particular situation. What do you do? It doesn't say the event equals the outcome. Take ownership of that situation and deal with it. Question I always ask, is your team equipped to thrive in adversity? When everything goes wrong, whether you have cash flow crisis, you have something goes wrong with a staff member, whatever it is, what do you do? Do you get cross, do you get angry, or do you live your values and work together as a team? So very simply, the message is here. It's all about your values, thinking about how do you work together as a team. You know things are going to go wrong at some point, so just remembering to get centred, take control of your reaction, and just to get super resourceful. The same skills we learnt in that business when we were messing up before, the same skills we needed when we were out there at sea. So, cutting a long story short, we finally circumnavigated. We got back to Grenada. That's where we crossed our outbound track, and clearly it was an amazing moment, but these were some of the things that got us there. We wouldn't have been able to have the success both in the business and also in family life if we didn't follow these things, about just getting that really clear story. I always get confused in corporate world with vision and mission, all that sort of stuff. For me, it's a story. Where are we going? Creating that culture, how do we work together? Building up the people, focusing on their strengths, and then finally, that last bit there, living your values and focusing on your reaction in any particular situation. So look, I hope that's been useful. I hope it's given you a few ideas. If you just take one idea from this and go and do something with that, that would be fantastic. But I guess the underlying thing, right, it's all about belief. If you set your goals out there, you're going to go and do that, then I'm absolutely convinced that you can go and make all those different things happen. So I mentioned there about the creating a business that can run without you. And because not many people have come across that concept, my wife and I, we run events on this now. We have one coming up on the 11th to 13th of February, so next month. And it's called Thrive Money Summit. So for 3 days, we're going to go deep into all the different things we did to create the transitions, both in family and in the business, to get that team in place. The price, just under $2,000 for the ticket, but as a Quandor members offer, I'll do it for $14.95 plus VAT. And if you go to that website there and you use the code Quandor, you can get the £500 off. So it's going to be a small event. We've got Richard Branson's marketing guy is going to come and do a talk for us. And actually, we've got a couple of people in the room actually are coming to it as well. So it'd be great to see some of you there if you want to find out how to make a business run without you. Thank you.